Hi, welcome to today's class. I'm Shree. I'm your English educator for grades 11 and 12. Today we're going to be starting our very first poem, and I'm very excited about that. But before we get into the lesson itself, as usual, there are a quick couple of things that I'm going to tell you. I know that if you've been watching the last couple of videos that I've put out, then you know what I'm going to say, so I'm very sorry that you have to hear it again. But this is for those of you who are new and listening to me for the first time, so that we can all be on the same page and know the same things before we start with our lesson. So first things first, these are our class timings. Class happens every day except for Sunday. Mondays, Wednesdays and Fridays are for grade 12. Tuesdays, Thursdays and Saturdays are for grade 11. Today we're going to be doing grade 12, so stick around for that. We'll be starting in just a bit. We also have classes that happen at other times. Yesterday, for instance, we had a class at 8 p.m. Classes that are revision classes or part 2 of a lesson or maybe MCQ practice or something like that will happen at these odd hours. They'll be decided and updated on the YouTube channel as and when time goes on. I do want to let you know that there's a way of keeping up with all of this. There's this Telegram channel, and there's a link in the description box below for the Telegram channel, and it's for class 11 and 12. You can join it, and basically you'll get updates on when which classes are happening and what the lessons that we're going to be covering or what the plan for the day is going to be. This means that you don't have to keep a very close eye on YouTube and keep checking up on what's going on there, which might make things a little bit easier for you, I thought. So that's something I wanted to tell you about, that there's this option available and you can take advantage of it. Now, another thing I want to say is that today's class is pre-recorded. That means I've recorded this far in advance of class timings, and so when it's playing to you, I'm not really talking to you live. That means that, you know, if you're saying anything to me, I can't actually like stop in the middle of class and read it. I went back and looked at the old videos again, and sometimes people come and they say hi, and I was feeling really bad that, you know, I can't stop and say hi back to you. So I just wanted to take a moment and say hello to everyone who's saying hi in advance of you actually saying anything. And I also wanted to let you know that you should be completely free to ask me questions, right? I know I can't see them immediately, but you can leave them in the chat, you can leave them in the comments, and I'll get back to you through a comment on this video. Feel free to ask me questions about the lesson, feel free to ask me questions about anything I've said that maybe wasn't clear to you, or if you have any questions about even the English syllabus or concept that you are unsure about in another chapter or something like that, any questions at all, then just feel completely free to ask me in the comment section, and I will go through the comments and I will definitely get back to you, so that, you know, that can be like our alternate way of somehow keeping in touch and keep talking to each other. And with all of that conveyed, today we're going to be doing the poem My Mother at 66 by Kamala. Before we get into the lesson, because this is our very first poem, I want to know what you all think about poetry. So let me know about that when you hear this question. Just type it out or something. I know that a lot of people have very complicated feelings about poetry. I know that some people struggle with poetry, some people enjoy it but don't know what to make of it, and some people really tussle with poetry. And I just wanted to let you know before we get into our very first poem that what we're going to be trying to do together is the same thing that we do for our prose lessons, which is read the poem and try to understand everything that's going on in the poem and try to make the most of all of the meaning that's in the poem. So we'll be going over this poem line by line as we did with the prose chapters. and it's going to be a lot easier with the poems, in fact, because they're going to be a lot shorter, right? So it's going to give us a lot more chance to get into a lot more of the depth of the material. With that preface done, who is Kamala Das? Kamala Das is an Indian writer. I think her name probably gives away that she's Indian. She writes both in Malayalam and in English. She is really well known for writing bold things. By bold, I mean that she writes things that people don't generally write about. She thinks about ideas that people don't generally think about. In fact, she wrote about a lot of things at a point of time when it was quite abnormal for women to be thinking about such things. So she was writing outside the norm. So all of her writing was very daring in that sense. It kind of broke all the existing rules about the things that people should be writing about and should be thinking about, especially women. And Kamala Das also writes very personal things. By this I mean not only that she writes about her own life, she writes poetry that's very much autobiographical, which means that it's about her own life, but she also writes about very personal feelings, in the sense that she writes about intimate thoughts that people have, the sort of thoughts that sometimes we find very difficult to express, even to completely voice, even to completely think. Those are the kinds of personal topics that she picks up and she puts in her writing. And in fact, today we're going to be reading a poem that has both of those things. It's both personal to the poet, and it's personal in the sense that it's about a very intimate feeling that a lot of people often have that we find maybe difficult to give voice to. With today's poem, we're going to be doing something slightly different than what we do with prose, because the poem is short. We're going to be reading the entire poem together once, and we're just going to sort of go with the poem as we read it and see what the poem is doing, see what sorts of thoughts it leaves us with, and then we're going to get into the line by line dissection of the poem. So now I'm just going to read the poem out for you. Driving from my parents' home to Cochin last Friday morning, I saw my mother beside me, doze, open-mouthed, her face ashen like that of a corpse, and realized with pain that she was as old as she looked, but soon put that thought away, and looked out at young trees sprinting, the merry children spilling out of their homes. But after the airport's security check, standing a few yards away, I looked again at her, wan, pale as a late winter's moon, and felt that old familiar ache, my childhood's fear. But all I said was, "See you soon, Amma." All I did was smile and smile and smile. It's a very short poem. Now, a question for you. What do you think this poem is about? And I'm going to give you a couple of seconds to sort of think about it. It's a very straightforward poem in the sense that it's not very obscure. It's not trying to hide things from you. It's kind of directly given us a lot of material. So, just 5 seconds of like silence for you to think, and then we'll get into the line by line dissection. Sorry. And I think that's 5 seconds. Generally not very good at keeping time, but okay. Driving from my parents' home to Cochin last Friday morning. So immediately we know that the narrator is traveling, and they've been at their parents' house. She's been at her parents' house, and now she's traveling from her parents' house to Cochin, and it's last Friday morning. So we also know that the narrator is writing this poem in retrospect. They're writing it at a point much after this has actually happened. So they're writing about that day in the past. I saw my mother beside me, doze, open-mouthed, her face ashen like that of a corpse. Okay. We know that on this journey to Cochin, the narrator and her mother are traveling together, and her mother is asleep beside her. So first things first, Cochin is Kochi, which is in Kerala. It's a location in Kerala. And this is, as we already discussed, a moment of travel. It's a moment of the narrator leaving their parents' home and going away somewhere else. And as we find out later along in the poem, the narrator is going to an airport. She is leaving to travel somewhere possibly far away, because you don't generally take planes to go to somewhere that's close by. And she is leaving her parents. So she's come to see her parents, and now she's going back to wherever she's come from. And it's time for saying goodbye to her mother. And as with most departures, this one is also filled with sorrow and filled with pain and some nostalgia and that sort of feeling when you're leaving someone when you don't really entirely want to go, because you look at them and you're like, when will I get to see you again? So all of those feelings are packed into acts of departure and moments of farewell, and all of those feelings are there in this moment also, this moment of departure. So that's something for us to keep in mind. And as the author, the narrator and her mother travel to Cochin, her mother falls asleep next to her, and she falls into quite a deep sleep. Doze means sleep, and the reason that we know that the sleep is possibly deep is because the mother is so fast asleep that her mouth is open. We don't generally like end up with our mouths open if we're just lightly sleeping or something like that. So it's pretty deep sleep. And the author, the narrator, sorry, I keep making the mistake. But yeah, the narrator looks at her mother, and her mother's face is very grey. And the narrator says, my mother's face is ashen like that of a corpse. Ashen means grey. It's a color that generally like refers to sort of tiredness. It means a kind of paleness. Ashen means that somebody's face looks a little lifeless. If your parents have ever looked at you and said, there's no color in your face, and what they mean by that is, are you eating well, are you sleeping well, are you taking care of yourself, because your face looks like it's lost a little bit of its energy and its strength. And that's the same sort of thing the narrator is feeling here, where she looks at her mother and her mother's face looks very tired and energyless, and so energyless in fact that the narrator compares it to that of a corpse. So she compares it to a dead person, and this brings in this imagery of death into the poem, and it directly compares this old mother to a dead person, and that's how tired and that's how lifeless she looks. And realized with pain that she was as old as she looked, but soon put that thought away. So the narrator has a realization that the mother is as old as she looks. Now, what does that mean? So, in this moment, the narrator looks at her mother and she realizes Amma looks old. And then she realizes Amma is old. And this doesn't mean that the narrator looks at her mother and sees the grey hair and the tiredness and thinks, oh, my mother is 66. She's as old as she looks. So she's actually 66. She's not realizing the actual literal age of her mother, right? She is recognizing in that moment that her mother carries the weight of all of those years of living. That her mother carries all of the weakness and the tiredness and the lack of strength that comes on as one ages. So when the author, the narrator, is realizing that her mother is looking her age, is looking like she's 66, the narrator means that, oh, my mother looks like she possesses all those characteristics, all that tiredness and lifelessness that comes with being so old. So that's what it means to here in this case, to say, oh, my mother is as old as she looks. I hope that's clear. And as the narrator realizes this, the narrator feels some pain. And it's very understandable that the narrator is feeling this pain, because this is her mother, and this is someone she's had around for all her life so far. And now she looks at her mother, who's presumably taken care of her for some time, and who's presumably seemed younger and like a stable presence in the narrator's life. And now suddenly she realizes that her mother is so old that she can be compared to a person who is dead. And so it brings the mother and death very close, right? That comparison to a corpse especially brings the age of this mother and her closeness to death very home to us. It tells us that the narrator is afraid that her mother is going to die, that this oldness means that her mother is nearing death. And so what the narrator does when the narrator feels pain is, immediately the narrator is like, okay, this thought is painful, I'm not going to think about it. So the narrator just sets the thought aside, and the narrator is like, I'm going to focus on different things. And does that work? And we will see if that works in the next bit of the poem. And looked out at young trees sprinting, the merry children spilling out of their homes. So the narrator's mother is sitting next to her, and looking at the narrator's mother, the narrator feels this sort of stabbing pain that the mother looks this old and looks this tired. So the narrator looks outside instead, in another direction, right? She looks out through the window, and she looks at trees and children outside. And so it seems like in that moment she's completely stopped thinking about her mother being old, and she stopped thinking about her mother being close to death. So the painful thought seems to have been put aside. Except, how does she define the trees and the children? How does she describe these two things that she sees outside the window to us? She says the young trees are sprinting. Sprinting means running very fast. The trees aren't actually running here. The narrator is in a vehicle, and the vehicle is moving, so it seems like the trees are running. It's like that feeling when you're sitting in a car and you're looking outside and everything seems to be moving outside of you, and you seem to be stiller in comparison to those things. So that's the sort of feeling and intention behind the phrase young trees sprinting. And she tells us that these trees are young. In fact, she even capitalizes the Y of the young and the T of the trees, and she is trying to tell us that this youth is important. Basically, there's a lot of highlight laid on it with the capital Y. So that's the first image that she tells us about. And the second image that she tells us about is merry children spilling out of their homes. So there are all of these young children, and they're all very happy, and they're spilling out of their homes. So they're rushing out of their homes. And now this comes up immediately after the narrator has just given us another image, right? The first image that she gives us is that of her mother asleep in a resting position, in a position that's very still, because in sleep we don't move at all. And then she gives us these two images instead, and that strikes a very severe contrast in comparison to the dozing mother who is ashen-faced, who looks lifeless and energyless and is completely static in the moment. In contrast, we have these young trees and these young children, and these children are full of life. They're happy, and both of these things, the sprinting of the trees and the spilling of the children, they're both action words, right? They're words full of movement, So both of these things are also full of movement, they're full of action, and that strikes up an even more strong contrast between the still mother and these active, energetic, young things, and this old, tired, static thing. And so we realize, because of the strongness of this contrast, that maybe that pain that the narrator was feeling, that her mother is old, hasn't actually been entirely put aside. The narrator hasn't been able to completely forget it, because even when she looks outside, she's describing things in opposition to that. So that is still influencing how she is describing these things. And so we know that that pain has just been, it's just an attempt, and it's not been an entirely successful attempt, and we'll see how it actually completely re-emerges, that pain, in a little bit. But after the airport's security check, standing a few yards away, I looked again at her, wan, pale as a late winter's moon, and felt that old familiar ache, my childhood's fear. So this part of the poem is set in the actual airport. They've reached their destination now, the airport, which is where the narrator is finally going to be, traveling decisively to another place, leaving her mother. And it's after the security check that this part of the poem happens. And the security check is the moment in the airport that is the end of when you can see the people who came with you, right? After that, you cross over and you won't be able to see those people anymore. So it's actually at the last second that she can see her mother, and that this happens. She sees her mother, and she sees her mother standing there, and they're already separated by some yards. Yards are a way of measuring space. And they're standing, they're already separated, there's a little bit of distance between the two of them. And her mother looks wan, which means pale and drained and tired. And then the narrator repeats the same word again in a different way. She says, wan, pale as a late winter's moon. So this time the narrator is comparing her mother to a late winter's moon. And if you've seen the moon in winter, in places where there is, a real winter and there's coldness and things like that, the light from the moon is a lot less. It's very dim. And so the narrator is bringing back the image that we had earlier, which is that image of the mother sleeping and looking ashen-faced. And here the mother again looks lifeless and pale and tired. And where there was very immediate death imagery of a corpse, here we get instead the imagery of a late winter's moon. And winter is the time that a year is ending, something is coming to a close. So again we have that sort of idea put into our heads about an ending that is going to happen. And knowing that the mother is growing old, we know that the ending that's being hinted to here is death. So the narrator sees her mother looking like this, and again she feels fear, right, that goes into her. And she calls it that old fear of childhood. And so she means to tell us that this fear that she has, that she is going to lose her mother, that her mother is going to die, is a childhood fear. It's a fear that she's had ever since childhood. This doesn't seem immediately obvious. This doesn't seem immediately understandable, actually, because you think about someone who's a little kid and their mother also is probably young back then. So why would a child look at their mother who is still young and think, oh, my mother's going to die? But it's a fear that a lot of children actually have, because at that particular point in our lives, we're spending a lot of time with our parents, right? And we're really close to them. And as soon as we sort of recognize and understand that death is something that happens to people around us, we immediately become afraid that it's going to happen to the people who are most close to us, who are most around us. And we're very afraid that the people that we're used to are going to be taken away from us. So that sort of fear does begin in childhood, and it's very sharp in childhood, and it actually can sort of go down over time and then come back in moments. And one of these moments is what the narrator and the author are having in this particular poem. So that's why she calls it a fear of childhood. And the narrator, doesn't actually say anything about the fear or anything. All she does is this. But all I said was, "See you soon, Amma." All I did was smile and smile and smile. So even though the narrator feels this kind of fear, she just looks at her mother and says, "I'll see you soon, Amma." And then the narrator smiles. Now, what do we make of this "see you soon"? It is an indication from the narrator that she will see her mother soon. It's a traditional farewell thing, right? You say, "I'll see you soon," especially in like native tongues. I think in Tamil, for instance, you generally say, "I'll come back," or "I'll see you again soon." That's roughly what it translates to, the traditional sort of farewell greeting. So the narrator is expressing a very conventional thing. It's just a thing that you say to people when you're leaving them. It's also probably sincere in the sense that the narrator does mean that she'll come back and she'll see her mother at some point. But in this context, in the context of this poem, knowing that the narrator has just had this immediate, very intense fear that she may never get to see her mother again, that her mother will die. We also know that this "see you soon" is a very desperate sort of "see you soon." It's a "see you soon" that's trying to convince the narrator herself that she will in fact see her mother soon. In some sense, this is also a moment in the poem that repeats the other part in the poem where the narrator looks outside, looks away from that scary thought she has, and looks at all of these other things and thinks about them in terms of opposites to the fear that she has. And here again, the narrator is feeling that fear, and instead of thinking about that fear or expressing that fear, the narrator is choosing to try to push that fear aside, and the narrator is instead trying to think about the opposite, which is, "I will see you again soon." So that's the kind of meaning and emotion that comes with "see you soon" in this particular moment. It's really the narrator trying to persuade herself that the opposite of her fears is what is going to happen. And then the narrator smiles. And how does the narrator put this? The narrator says, "All I did was smile and smile and smile." 3 times. Why write smile 3 times? Now, when someone says, "I smiled," that's them saying, "Oh, I made that particular facial expression and possibly I was happy in that moment." But in this moment, the smile has been repeated 3 times to kind of drive in the fact that the narrator again is trying very hard to smile. There's a lot of force, there's a lot of pressure that she's putting on herself. She's very desperate to smile. She's trying to smile, and so the smile is again carrying the same kind of desperate persuasion, self-persuasion that "See you soon, Amma" had. It's not a genuine smile so much as it is a smile that is just trying very hard to be a smile. And also it ends, this entire poem ends in an ellipsis. An ellipsis is sort of a set of trailing dots. And an ellipsis is a punctuation mark that generally sort of points out that something has been left unsaid. It's not a full stop, right? It's not a complete sentence. Something is trailing off into the unknown. And that bit of information that's been left out, those words that haven't been discussed, they're generally something that's relevant to the situation also. And in this case, for instance, we know what those words are, we know what's been left unsaid, we know the lingering thought that has been left unexpressed in this poem and by the author, by the narrator entirely, which is the fear that the mother is going to die. In fact, not only does the narrator not mention it in the last moment of this poem, the narrator doesn't mention death at all throughout the poem. So the narrator does not actually give voice to the fear that's haunting her throughout the poem. It's completely left unsaid throughout and throughout. It's just like a ghost in the background. And so this ellipsis where, you know, you have that lingering sense of something in the background, somewhere that's not been completed. Yeah, it's a very good, very fitting sort of end to the poem. Okay. Some themes in this poem that we've already really discussed while we were talking about this poem. First, there is old age, the complicated feelings that come when people around us are growing old, especially the sort of complications when a child watches their parents grow old. It's a very difficult feeling because it's a very helpless feeling. You can't really do anything about the fact that someone is aging, and you know that age comes with this potential that death is closer by, and that's a very difficult thing to sit with. And when you can't do anything to change that, it makes it all the more difficult. So all of those difficult feelings about old age are in this poem. And the very difficult feelings that also come up in a farewell, when you're saying goodbye to someone, and you know, we talked about this at the very beginning, and I told you that you don't know like when you're going to see them again, and that's the same sort of thing when you put it together with old age. It's sort of, you don't know if you're ever going to see them again. So both of these things kind of come together in this poem, leaving someone who's old, and how that is a lot more complicated in some way because of the possibility of death and all of the fear that comes up with that. So those are some themes that come up in the poem. It's a very, I mean, it's a very touching poem in that sense, because it captures a feeling that everyone has likely felt at some point or the other. It captures the sort of universal worry that people have, if not about their mothers, maybe their fathers, maybe somebody else in their life who is growing old, maybe somebody else in their life who isn't the healthiest at this particular point. So it gets that like constant feeling that people do end up feeling at some point or the other really, really well. And another theme in this poem is, it's in these two lines: I put that thought away, and all I did was smile and smile and smile. So we already discussed how the poet doesn't actually give words to the fear that is haunting her, and so the narrator also doesn't give words to the fear that is haunting her. And this sort of looking away, literally at one point in the poem, from the thing that's frightening you, is a thing that everyone does, right? If something is so big and so distressing that it has the potential to break our hearts, then we don't want to pay it attention, because the thought of paying it attention makes it very real to us, and we don't want it to be real to us. And so we try our best to not give it that attention and not take it that seriously, and so try to take away some of the seriousness from it. And in this particular instance, because the thing that the narrator is afraid of is death and old age leading into death, this becomes all the more an option that someone is likely to take, right? This avoidance, because that's something, it's a situation that you can do absolutely nothing about. As I said, you're helpless about the situation, and so because you can't actually have any sort of solution to this problem, to this pain, you do the next best thing and you choose to avoid it. And that's a theme that comes up in this poem again. So again, a very universal theme, and not necessarily only like limited to death, to the fear of death. Sorry, I really need some water. Okay. Now I'm just gonna show the poem to you again. and actually maybe we'll read it together again, the entire poem, and then we'll look at other things in the poem, like poetic devices, and how's the poem, like what's the form of the poem, like is it rhyme schemes and things like that. Let me just get a little bit more water and then I'll actually read the poem out to you. You can keep looking at it until then. Well, okay. Driving from my parents' home to Cochin last Friday morning, I saw my mother beside me, doze, open mouthed, her face ashen like that of a corpse, and realized with pain that she was as old as she looked, but soon put that thought away, and looked out at young trees sprinting, the merry children spilling out of their homes, but after the airport's security check, standing a few yards away. I looked again at her, wan, pale as a late winter's moon, and felt that old familiar ache, my childhood's fear. But all I said was, "See you soon, Amma." All I did was smile and smile and smile. Actually, before we get into the poetic devices, I just want to talk a little about familiar ache. I don't think I brought this up while we were talking about it earlier, but it's an old and a familiar ache, which means that this is a pain that the narrator is used to. The narrator knows the pain very well, and it's a pain that's been with her for a long time. So she says it's an old familiar ache. But now let's get back to the form and poetic devices and things like that. First question. Did you notice the rhyme scheme? I'll just take us back. Look at it. Look at it. Is there any sort of rhyme scheme going on? There is absolutely no rhyme scheme in this poem. It is a blank verse, which means a poem that isn't following any sort of rhyme scheme and is just sort of going with a non-rhythmic, non-rhyming flow. It's actually it's a genre of poetry. Blank verse is called a genre of poetry. A lot of people write in blank verse, especially these days. Now, what kind of punctuations did you notice in the poem? And I'll take you back again, and you can look. There's a bunch of commas, there's some apostrophes which are very necessary in most sentences. And after the commas, we only have the ellipsis. So, in short, there are no full stops anywhere in this poem. There's just a bunch of commas and then an ellipsis. So, this entire poem reads sort of like one continuous line. It's kind of a lot of thoughts that go from here to there to there to here, and then the poem sort of trails off incomplete. So this entire poem is like one thread, and a thread that sort of just runs off without ending. Third, I want to ask you about poetic devices that you may have found in this poem. Similes. We have two similes in this poem. There is face ashen like a corpse and pale as a winter's moon. And both of these are similes about the mother that is being made by the narrator, and both of these similes are comparing the mother to it's actually a late winter's moon. I'm sorry, I haven't added late here, but yeah, both of these similes are trying to compare the mother's paleness and the lifelessness, and how close she is to death, how she seems like she's very close to death. They're comparing it to two different things, the corpse and the winter's moon. And both of these the corpse comes with that lifelessness and the grayness that comes with death on the face of a dead body. And with the winter's moon is actually less full of light. So the paleness is there, and a corpse signifies death because it's a dead body, and a late winter's moon signifies the end of a year because it is late winter and something is coming to an end. So death is brought back into the comparison here. So both of these similes are quite similar in how they work, although the comparisons themselves are different. So similes are our first poetic device. Our second poetic device is imagery. There's a lot of imagery in a lot of poems, very honestly. So that's something you can always look out for in a lot of poems. And actually, I kind of just assume that you know what a simile is, but a simile is when two things are being compared to each other, and they're being compared to each other directly, which means that there is generally a connecting word like or as that says this is being compared to this. And so here, face ashen like a corpse. So that kind of direct comparison is being made, so that's why it's a simile. Imagery is when the writing is trying to build up a particular visual picture for you. So this poem has a lot of those things. Like if you close your eyes and you listen to this poem, then you can imagine the scenes in the poem really well. And there are some very distinct moments of this imagination. Everything from the narrator's mother's face, the way the face looks, the way the trees are, the way the children are, the moment in the airport again, all of this is very bright imagery, distinct moments when you can picture these scenes in these moments. So that's another poetic device. And another poetic device is personification. We have young trees sprinting in this poem. Now, personification is when an inanimate object is talked about as though it has life. In this case, for instance, the narrator says, young trees sprinting. So the young trees are running, but young trees are actually not capable of running, right? So they're pretty still. And so these inanimate trees are being imbued with this action of running, with this movement that they generally can't do. So this is an example of personification that's happening in this poem. And finally, we have repetition, which is a very easy to understand poetic device. Repetition is just when a poet uses a word or a phrase again and again to try to drive a particular point home. And in this particular case, in the case of this poem, the repetition is smile and smile and smile, and we already discussed what the point of that repetition is. That actually brings us to the end of the poem, but I just want to draw your attention to one final last thing. I want to talk to you about the overall form of this poem, right? And how, in some sense, you can seem to split this poem into two parts. It's not actually split into verses, stanzas, or anything like that, but there seem to be two parts to this poem. One part is the part where the narrator and the mother are in the vehicle and they're traveling to Cochin together. The other part is the part after the airport security check. And the thing is, both of these parts mirror each other completely. What do I mean by that? I mean that, so we open in the first segment. We know that the narrator and the mother are traveling together. What happens during this moment of traveling is that the narrator looks at the mother, realizes how lifeless the mother looks, and then the narrator is worried. Similarly, in the other part, we have the narrator and the mother at an airport security check, and the narrator looks at the mother, realizes how pale the mother looks. In both these cases, a simile is used, and then the narrator gets worried. So perfect mirroring is happening until now. And then for the conclusion to both of these segments, in the first bit, the narrator looks out the window, and then the narrator sort of tries to think that she's not really thinking about this, and the narrator instead looks at other things, and and looks at those other things in opposition to the way that she describes her mother. And in the same way, in the next part, the narrator looks at her mother and feels that worry, and then instead of thinking about the worry, she tries to look away from the worry, and she tries instead to emphasize the opposite of that worry and say, oh, I'll see you soon, and smile instead of showing the worry. And so we see this kind of perfect mirroring that's going on in these two little segments within the poem. And this also drives home to us the way this fear keeps coming back, right? It doesn't happen and then go away completely. It happens, it goes away very briefly, and even then it's still there somewhere, and then it comes back immediately, and it stays. And it shows us that this is a very cyclical process, that this is likely to keep on happening for the narrator. And yeah, that's the final thing that I wanted to talk to you about with regard to this poem. I hope you like this class. I hope you like this poem. Also, I started enjoying this poem a lot after I really looked at it and sort of tried to understand it better. So I'm hoping that also sort of happened for you. That said, I have a couple of last things to say to you, which is, in case you don't know, there is an Unacademy app. You can get on Google Play Store, and it's called, I've actually forgotten the name of the app, so I'm just gonna look at it. Give me a second. Sorry about this. I used the Educator version of the app because I am an educator. So I've forgotten the name of the Learners app. I think it's just called Unacademy Learner app. Yeah, it's called Unacademy Learner app. I opened it up. So you can get on Google Play Store and you can download the Unacademy Learner app. And it's been a while since I've looked through it, but I can tell you that it has a lot of really cool features. For instance, it has an Ask It Out feature, which means that you can sort of just log in. You'll just have to give your phone number in order to log in, and then it'll sign you up if you give it the OTP, and you log into the app, and you can basically choose which grade you want to learn for, etc. So once you make all of those choices for yourself, which language you want to learn in and things like that, once you've made that, it'll basically show you like the app that will best work for you and the courses that will best work for you. So there's a segment in that called Ask It Out, and you can basically click on Ask It Out, and you can take a picture of like a doubt that you have and maybe just send it through so that somebody can get back to you, and we will reply very quickly and you will get an answer to a doubt that you have. And another thing I want to let you know is that the app also has like a bunch of free things. You have quizzes and mock tests and things like that. So you should go and make the most of all of those things. You can kind of just take advantage of all of those things and get a lot of practice in, especially for this new CBSE setup. I also have a code that you can use for the app. It's THAR01, and this code is specifically actually for if you want a subscription to Unacademy Plus. Access to the app will give you access to a lot of free features, but there are a bunch of special courses and a bunch of special content and access to like the study material of that content, and quizzes that come with that content, and practice tests that come with that content, all of which you get access to if you go in for an Unacademy Plus subscription. Now, these are some of the durations for which you can take a Plus subscription, and as you can see, the price kind of reduces. The per month cost reduces as you carry on over time. You also have something called Unacademy Iconic, which is like Plus, but it's a lot more individual. So, when you log into the app and you sort of pick all of these settings that work best for you, it's like that kind of exacerbated. Exacerbated is the wrong word. What I mean is, it's like that twofold. In the sense that you'll get personal one-on-one guidance from an educator, and you'll have live doubt clearing sessions that you can access, and you'll get reports about how you're doing, and your parents can also be in touch and find out how you're doing and get reviews of that. And so this is basically like free. This is not free, but this is access to every feature that Unacademy has to offer you. So that is iconic, and these are the prices for iconic. As you can see, again, costs vary based on the duration that you take it for, and for some of them, if you go for like a longer duration of time, the per month cost is less. Yes, and I want to let you know that you can actually get 10% off on these things if you use this code that I have, which is THAR01. And this month, for the next couple of days until 30th, there is actually a special offer that's going on where you get a flat 10% discount if you purchase plus subscriptions for any durations at all, and it's only valid for the first 500 people who go in for this offer. So in case you're interested in the Plus and Iconic subscription, now is the time to take advantage of that discount and be part of the first 500. That said, thank you for being here with me today. I hope you liked today's class, and if you did, do leave a like, do leave comments if you have questions, and do subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Thank you.